In this session, we're going to take a look at file access tracking in EventSentry. That's part of the security and compliance component. Now, file access tracking is one of the few features in EventSentry that's not enabled by default, and for that purpose, I created a file access tracking package, made it global, and added the file access object to it. Now, file access tracking works by intercepting Windows events that are logged when files are being accessed, which usually generates 4663 events. It normalizes these events, does a little bit of additional processing, and then logs them to the web reports, where you can then review reporting to see who's been accessing, modifying, reading, and so forth files that are being audited. It's important to note that this feature, just like all the other features in the security and compliance component, don't actually generate any alerts. It strictly provides reporting in the web reports. What's particularly important in this feature is that the proper auditing is set up, and it's one of the few features where two different audit settings will have to be enabled in Windows and in the domain. In order to see this, I'm going to switch over to our System32 website and take a look at the 4663 event. There's other events that are taken into consideration for this feature, but 4663 is the main event that's logged by Windows whenever files are being audited. And if we scroll down a little bit, we can see what audit settings will have to be enabled. And the main one is the Object Access Audit category, along with the File System subcategory. So if this is not enabled on that host, whether it's through group policy scripts or through the local security policy, if it's not a domain member, then it doesn't matter what audit settings you enable, you will not see the 4663 events. So this feature will simply not work if the 4663 events are not logged by Windows. So the first thing you'll want to do is make sure that your domain policy, the group policy that configures your audit settings, has that enabled. Now, just enabling this will not generate any events. It basically is just sort of a general switch, a passageway that the information has to go through, the settings go through. If that's closed, then nothing will happen, but it has to be enabled, and just enabling that will not audit any events. That's being set by the actual auditing that you configure on the folders. So I'm going to go here, and I have a file monitoring file share test here that I created. And if we right click, so if we look into this share, we have a couple of test files in here. And I'm going to right click that folder, go to the security tab. So this is where we configure who has access to this folder. But what we are concerned about, of course, are the audit settings. So we're going to switch to the audit tab here, and we can see that everybody here is being audited. If we click edit, so with add, of course, we could add another principal to be audited. But if you click edit, we'll see, if you click on show advanced permission, that create files, so write and writing data, as well as create folders and appending data, writing attributes, deleting, changing permissions. So anything that really modifies anything is actually being audited here by Windows. So whether or not EventSentry is running or configured is pretty much irrelevant. With these audit settings in place here, we are making sure that 4663 events are written to the security event log. So there's really two steps and two advantages. So you have these 4663 events no matter what. So not so much a disadvantage that EventSentry requires this, but an advantage because it's sort of a two-layer process. Now, once the auditing is configured, then EventSentry can intercept and normalize these events for you. And so to see this, let's go back here into EventSentry. So looking at this dialog, this is again fairly simple to configure here. We have two main options here: track directories listed below or track all file access activity. In most cases, track all file access activity is the preferred option and easier to set up. This essentially simply intercepts all these audit events that are being generated and then transfers that information to the web reports. And the only configuration option you really have available here is filtering the types of audit events you want to see in the web reports. So if you have a lot of auditing set up, maybe for read access that you don't necessarily want to have in EventSentry, then you can filter this out here. So for example, with this configuration here, what we're saying is, well, let's look at every 4663 event, but we're only going to collect data that affects write access. So write data, appending data, and deleting data, as well as changing permissions and the ownership of a file. So if it matches this criteria, then EventSentry will pick it up. We could furthermore exclude certain file types and extensions. So here it says track all audited files, but exclude patterns listed on the right. So this is very similar to other features in EventSentry. So here we could say, well, let's not track temp files, for example. And I could simply do this here. And we can also exclude data from specific processes. So the 4663 event generally includes the process name that actually made the change. So for file shares, that's not that relevant because it will always be a system process that does this, but sometimes audit events are generated because a specific process is generating these audit events. So you can filter based on this here as well. So if there's a very noisy process that generates a lot of audit activity, then that can be excluded here. So for example, you could say, my process.exe, my other process.exe, and then those processes, anything that's audited from these processes would not be making it into EventSentry. It will still be in the security event log, it'll still be there, but it won't be in the EventSentry web reports. And down here, familiar option, where are we storing this data in? Are we enabling auditing automatically in EventSentry? Again, recommended you set this on a group policy that there's no conflict, but if you can't, then you can simply set this to auditing on. And finally, we can try to retrieve the source IP and hostname and available. So this is obviously relevant and useful for file servers. So when you have a client connecting to your file server, which then in turn generates this 4663 event, then EventSentry can try to determine, well, from which workstation did this change originate. Now, before we take a look at the other configuration option, track directories listed below, we're going to take a look at the web reports to see what this looks like in action. So I'm going to go to the first tab here and go to File Access right here. And you'll see that there is already some test data here. Again, quick glance, we can see that the only file that's been affected was test3.txt. We can click on Detailed, and we can see that the file test3.txt was modified. Data was written to it. We can see the file size after the change. So the file size increased. We can see the user that made that change. And we can also see from which IP address that change was performed. And that was actually this remote desktop session that I'm in where I was making those changes from. Now, of course, auditing doesn't care from where I make these changes. I could make these changes locally here as well. So I can say test change. And then we can go back to the reporting, refresh it, and we can see, okay, the source computer is actually empty because the change was made locally. In this case, we can see the caller, so we can actually see that the activity was made by Notepad because it was local. We can see that data was appended. We can see the file size because I reduced the file size. We also have the logon ID here. I'll collapse this a bit. Now I'm going to go back here. Open that same file remotely. I say remote change test. Save it. And we can see this time the source computer shows up again. We can see that data was written to it. Now the file size is 34 bytes. And the caller is empty because it's just the system process here on that EventSentry server that actually wrote the data to the file through the file share. So that's really how simple it is. So you can go back to the summary. We can, of course, filter as always. You can say, okay, well, show me everything that Notepad changed. And that would just be in that one line. And of course, you can filter on the action, modify, details, and so forth. Now, what does the other configuration option mean? If we set this to track directories listed below, then the dialog changes a little bit. Overall, it's still the same, but we now have additional options available. One is called normalize and verify, and normalize, verify, and filter. Now, normalize and verify essentially creates a checksum of the files as well. So instead of simply intercepting those 4663 events and transferring the data to this report here, you'll notice that the checksum here is empty. Well, if we set this and if we configure a directory here, so let's say, for example, we use that same directory on this file server, we go to C, file share test. We can select the same options here. So this dialog hasn't really changed. We can leave this as is. Now, if we do this now, then normalize and verify will actually create a checksum of every file that's being changed. If We can also specify a maximum size, file size for checksums. So if we say, well, if a file is more than 100 megabytes, we don't want to create a checksum. And normalize, verify, and filter. So this is more of a leftover option for users of older operating systems, specifically Windows 2003 and earlier, where Windows audit events were logged even when files were not actually being modified. So if you were looking to audit write access, for example, to a file, then Windows would have logged 560 events, even though the file was never actually changed. So if you're running Windows 2008 and later, which hopefully you are, then the normalize, verify, and filter option is not something that you'll need. So you'll need the normalize only if you're not interested in checksums, or the normalize and verify if you want to get the file checksums of select directories as well. I'm going to set this back. I'm going to say yes. So now the directories are gone again. And that's really how simple it is. So if you're just looking for a basic file access activity, then simply set it to that option, configure the type of access that you're interested in, set up exclusions for files, set up exclusions for processes, and you'll have really nice, convenient reporting available that shows you exactly which files were accessed. You don't have to look at the raw events. I mean, of course, they're still available and you can look at them, but EventSentry really simplifies this a lot. And if the information from the remote host is available, then you can also see from where the change actually came from. Because if we look at the event here, then you will see that we do not have this IP address listed here. EventSentry deduced that from the logon ID. So the only requirement for this to work is that the EventSentry agent on the file server was running or started before the remote client created a logon session, because EventSentry keeps track of these logon sessions, and that's how it resolves the IP address. So as long as the agent was running before that remote client with that IP address logged on to that file server, then you will have that type of information.